Hey everybody, welcome back. So this is going to be our first case study. And for this first case study, we're going to dive in and try to get an understanding of why the UN doesn't have an agreed upon definition for terrorism. And this will fit well, I think, into our whole discussion that we had in the lecture about the difficulties with trying to arrive at one unified definition for the term. So the UN General Assembly doesn't have a singular definition of what constitutes terrorism. So they have specific conventions on particular acts that they have been willing to try to use to supposedly counter terrorism and deal with funding of terrorism. So there are specific conventions about the use of bombings and financing groups that engage in particular activities. But even these have some elements of vagueness to them. And this is largely based on the fact that they don't have a unified definition. And they really have been trying to come up with a working definition since the founding of the United Nations in the mid 1940s. And this has been a problem ever since it was created, and it actually plagued the predecessor organization, if anybody knows anything about the League of Nations that was created in the 1920s after World War I. They never were actually able to ratify a singular definition of terrorism. They had a proposed definition, never ratified it, and the UN has continued to struggle and has tried at various points to really take up the task of coming up with a singular definition. They tried in the 1970s when there was a spike, and we'll talk about a little bit, a real spike, especially in left-wing terrorism. There was an attempt to try to come up with a definition. Then again in the 1990s, there was another attempt that failed to come to a single unified definition. And then it was picked up again in the early 2000s, especially after 9/11, still could not come up with a definition that the entire UN General Assembly could agree upon for how we think about and how we'd actually define terrorism. But they have a working draft and a proposed definition that they have been trying to pass since the mid 1990s. So let's look at this and we'll read it out. And then I think it'll be good to go through and explore some of the various issues with the definition. And then we'll discuss a little bit more some of the very specific reasons why the current definition has not been accepted. So here's the definition. It says, any person commits an offense within the meaning of this convention if that person by any means unlawfully and intentionally causes a death or serious bodily injury to any person, or serious damage to public or private property, including a place of public use, a state or government facility, a public transportation system, an infrastructure facility, or the environment, or damage to property, places, facilities, or system referred to in paragraph 1b of this article resulting or likely to result in major economic loss. When the purpose of the conduct by its nature of context is to intimidate a population or to compel a government or an international organization to do or abstain from doing any act. Okay, so if you want to, I'd recommend maybe you could pause it for a second, try to jot down what you think might be a few issues with this definition, just to get you thinking about it. All right, so if you did that, thought of some ideas, restarted the video, there's a number of places we can start here. Well, first, maybe let's start with maybe some positives, right? It has this element in the final part of the definition where it talks about intimidating a population, compelling a government, right? So this element of fear being a component of the definition is there. But we could also argue perhaps that's a pretty low bar, pretty low threshold for a definition to meet. There's a lot of other criteria, context, things we have to think about to really flesh out and develop a good definition, as we talked about in the lecture. So how can we think about some of these particular issues? Well, first off, we want to think about the fact that it's not particularly clear whether government actions constitute terrorism under this framework, or if it has to be non-state actors. This is an important element. Governments, as we talked about a little bit in the lecture, we'll talk about more going forward. Can governments engage in terrorism? This is just a continuous question that gets asked. And perhaps even if we say they can, do we think about state terrorism as perhaps having even just a different definition than non-state actors who engage in terrorism? So that right off the bat presents a lot of issues with this definition. Who are the actors? Can it be governments? Is it only non-state actors? And then we get to this issue of the question of terrorism versus right to self-determination. So the age-old question, one in proverb, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, right? Does this again largely depend on the context and the perspective of the individual viewing the event? And this will be an important element that we're going to talk about next, into an important element why this definition hasn't actually been passed by the UN. So we'll put a pin in that for a second. The next is the question about this definition that we need to think about is, do acts committed by members of a country's armed forces constitute terrorism? So this again somewhat gets into the issue of government actions versus non-state actors, but do we think about the actions taken by individuals in a country's armed forces? Are they capable of engaging in terrorism? There's a lot of disagreement about that. And then maybe it just comes down to trying to separate definitions out between state terrorism versus non-state actor terrorism. We also get into the issue here, there isn't a specific mention of nuclear weapons. And during the debates and arguments about the construction of this definition, a lot of countries wanted to include the use of nuclear weapons into this framework of this definition because of the absolute incredible proportion of scale of the use of those weapons, even by a country, not even just a non-state actor, needed to be included because of the sheer terror that those weapons create based on their scale. But it's not included in this framework, and that's something to think about. We also have, again, this issue of trying to think about how this definition really gives us a good ability to differentiate between what we might simply call criminality versus terrorism. So some might argue that, yes, terrorism is a type of criminality, but how do we go about determining, and if we think about perhaps potentially subjective context, what constitutes maybe a normal way of thinking about what might be a criminal act that doesn't necessarily ultimately reach the scale of what we consider to be terrorism? And then who is it who can make the determination about, well, the destruction, damage of this particular property was simply an act of criminality versus taking it to the scale of this was an act of terrorism? And that's a fine line that may be blurred by people's perspectives on a particular incident or event. So that's another thing that becomes difficult in this definition. Another element is thinking about types of actions that aren't included. So nowhere in this does it include the issue of hostage taking or kidnapping. So hostage taking, kidnapping may cause bodily harm, but what if it doesn't? What if it's simply psychological harm? And what about just the simple act of hostage taking and kidnapping? Not included in this definition. So do we think about that as something that constitutes terrorism? Again, an important thing to think about. This is a big issue, especially in the 1970s, when many individuals engaged in what various countries considered terrorist acts by hijacking planes to elicit demands. But we don't see the inclusion of hijacking and kidnapping in this particular framework. So does that constitute an act of terror? We also don't have an element of this definition that's saying who are the main targets, right? Is it, as we had this over and over, I discussed in the previous lecture where we had the discussion about, is it civilian or is it military targets? Can it be both? Does it just have to be civilian targets? not included in this definition again, right? We have to think about who the targets are, and that's an important element of this framework as well. And then again, as you can see through a lot of this different elements that make this definition difficult to agree upon, difficult for the international community, 196 different states to agree upon, is subjective terminology, right? We look at terms such as serious bodily injury, serious damage to public or private property. Well, what constitutes serious damage, serious bodily injury, right? A lot of that may come down to the perspective of the eye of the beholder, different countries having different perspectives. And when different countries have different perspectives, right, it's hard for it to become a universal legal code because each country may implement it and think about it differently. And that's difficult then to have an international standard when what's considered serious damage in one country doesn't match the same definition in another country. And so that creates another major issue here with trying to come up with one unified definition. So let's talk about some of the real practical reasons as well, besides all of these issues that we talked about with coming up with this definition and why a lot of states can't agree. One of the main primary sticking points is the Israel-Palestine conflict. And the last real effort when they tried to pass the definition of their definition of terrorism in the UN General Assembly failed in the early 2000s, and that was largely because about 56 Middle Eastern states, North African states, disagreed based on the Israel-Palestine conflict. And this gets back again to this difficulty in trying to make a determination of terrorism versus freedom fighters / right to self-determination. So the question was here, do the acts of the Palestinians count as acts of terrorism? If they are fighting for their freedom and fighting for independence, right to self-determination, well, how can we consider that terrorism? And so, but other countries, Israel, United States, other countries like that said, no, these acts taken by a lot of groups in Palestine, such as the PLO, constitute terrorism. And so this again gets down to this difficulty that plagues a lot of definitions of terrorism, is the subjective nature of the individual looking at a particular event or from the particular perspective of the groups either committing the act of violence or those on the receiving end. And this is a major reason why coming to a definition of what terrorism is for the international community is so difficult and probably will always remain a problem. There probably won't ever be a singular unified definition for the international community. And as we said, it's very difficult even for other, it's not agreed upon the international community among states. It's not agreed upon among scholars who create definitions. It's not agreed upon even within countries. When you look at different definitions, even in the United States, across different organizations like the FBI, Department of Defense, Department of State, all have different definitions of terrorism. And so we constantly run into this issue of not having a single unified definition. So I'll end it here with your third discussion question, the final one for the day. Discussion question 3 is, why might it be a problem for the international community to not have an agreed upon definition of terrorism? Again, discussion question 3. Why might it be a problem for the international community to not have an agreed upon definition of terrorism? All right, we'll leave it there for today. Hope you had a good first day. Look forward to reading your discussion question posts on the boards, and I will talk to you again soon.